Who were the real powers behind medieval thrones? Picture this. It's 1141, and England is literally tearing itself apart in a civil war. On one side, there's Stephen of Blois, who basically stole the throne. On the other side, there's the rightful heir, a woman named Matilda, who's so badass she escaped from Oxford Castle by climbing down the walls in the dead of winter, dressed in white to blend with the snow, and walking across the frozen Thames River. This isn't Game of Thrones. This actually happened. Welcome to the real medieval world, where women weren't just sitting around in towers waiting to be rescued. They were starting wars, ending them, writing the first feminist manifestos, having visions that changed Christianity, and basically running Europe while pretending men were in charge. Today we're talking about the women who refused to play by the rules in an era when the rules said they shouldn't even exist in public life. And before you think this is going to be some sanitized girl power narrative, no. These women were complicated, sometimes ruthless, occasionally wrong, but always refusing to be forgotten. They fought with armies and with words. They used marriage as a weapon and divorce as a declaration of independence. They turned convents into centers of learning and medical research. Some of them literally rewrote what it meant to be a woman. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who played kingdoms like chess. Let's start with Eleanor of Aquitaine, because honestly, her life makes most Netflix series look boring. Born around 1122, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine when she was 15, making her the most eligible bachelorette in Europe. Aquitaine was massive, bigger than the lands controlled by the King of France. So when she married Louis VII of France, she wasn't some princess being traded for an alliance. She brought more land to the marriage than he had. But here's where it gets interesting. Eleanor went on the Second Crusade with Louis. Not as baggage, she brought her own vassals, commanded troops, and supposedly dressed as an Amazon warrior. The marriage fell apart partly because she kept having daughters. Medieval sexism blamed women for not producing sons, despite biology being the man's department, but mostly because Eleanor was done with Louis's weakness. So what does she do? She gets an annulment on grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related, which was hilarious because everyone in European nobility was related. Within 8 weeks, she marries Henry of Anjou, who becomes Henry II of England. She's 30, he's 19, and together they create the Angevin Empire that stretches from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Eleanor gave Henry 8 children, including Richard the Lionheart and King John, yes, the villain from Robin Hood. But when Henry started flaunting his mistresses and treating their sons badly, Eleanor didn't cry into her pillow. She convinced her sons to rebel against their father. When that failed, Henry imprisoned her for 16 years. But here's the thing about Eleanor. Prison didn't break her. When Henry died in 1189, she emerged at age 67 and basically ran England while Richard went crusading. When Richard was captured and held for ransom, Eleanor personally traveled across Europe to negotiate his release. When John became king after Richard's death, she was still there, in her 70s, defending his throne. She died in 1204 at the age of 82, having been Queen of France, Queen of England, mother of 2 kings, crusader, rebel, prisoner, and regent. She controlled more of France than the French king and outlived almost everyone who tried to control her. Empress Matilda. The woman who should have been king before Eleanor, there was Matilda, and her story is even more metal. She was supposed to be the first queen regnant of England. Her father, Henry I, made all his nobles swear an oath to accept her as heir after his only legitimate son died in a shipwreck. But when Henry died in 1135, her cousin Stephen basically said, "LOL no," and seized the throne because, she was a woman. Matilda didn't write strongly worded letters. She invaded England. What followed was called the Anarchy, 19 years of civil war that was basically Matilda saying, "That's my throne," and proving it with armies. She actually captured Stephen in battle in 1141 and had herself declared Lady of the English, not Queen, because even she had to play some politics. But she made a crucial mistake. She was arrogant and alienated the people of London, who drove her out before she could be crowned. The war continued back and forth. At one point, Matilda was trapped in Oxford Castle during a siege. It was winter, supplies were running out, and Stephen's forces surrounded the castle. So what does Matilda do? She and 4 knights dressed entirely in white lowered themselves from the castle walls at night and walked across the frozen moat and river, invisible against the snow, passing right through enemy lines. She never got her crown, but her son became Henry II, Eleanor's husband, founding the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for centuries. Every English monarch since has descended from Matilda. She didn't win the war, but she won history. Hildegard of Bingen, the nun who knew everything. Now let's talk about Hildegard of Bingen, who was basically the Leonardo da Vinci of the 12th century, except she was a nun and also claimed God was personally texting her. Born in 1098, Hildegard was given to a monastery at age 8 as a tithe to God, literally her parents' 10th child. She started having visions at age 3. She described them as the reflection of the living light, but kept them secret for decades because, medieval times weren't great about women claiming direct hotlines to God. At 42, she finally started writing about her visions, and they were wild. She described the universe as a cosmic egg, anticipated modern ideas about circulation and the nervous system, and created the first morality play, basically inventing musical theater. She wrote books on medicine that cataloged hundreds of plants and their uses, described diseases in detail that wouldn't be matched for centuries, and even created her own alphabet and language because apparently Latin wasn't good enough. But here's what's really insane: she got away with it. In an age when women could be burned for heresy for way less, Hildegard was corresponding with popes, emperors, and kings. Pope Eugenius III read her work and officially authorized her to keep writing. She went on 4 preaching tours, at a time when women weren't supposed to speak in church. Her music is otherworldly. While everyone else was writing simple Gregorian chants, Hildegard was composing pieces with ranges that spanned 2.5 octaves. She wrote 77 songs and the first known morality play, Ordo Virtutum, which features the battle between virtues and the devil for a human soul. The devil is the only character who doesn't sing. He can only shout and grunt because evil can't create beauty. She founded 2 monasteries, stood up to bishops, and when the church tried to punish her community for burying an excommunicated man, she basically told them to get bent, arguing that the man had been reconciled before death. She was 81 years old at this point, and still fighting the patriarchy. When she died in 1179, her nuns claimed 2 streams of light appeared in the sky and crossed over her room. She wasn't officially canonized until 2012. It only took the Catholic Church 833 years to recognize what everyone already knew: the supporting cast, who deserves their own shows. These 5 women are just the headline acts. Behind them stands an army of medieval women who refuse to be silenced. Matilda of Tuscany, 1046 to 1115, called the Great Countess. She controlled vast territories in northern Italy, commanded armies personally, and was the only person who could make the Holy Roman Emperor literally kneel in the snow begging for forgiveness from the Pope. Melisende of Jerusalem, 1105 to 1161, ruled the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, first with her husband, then with her son, then basically told her son to sit down and shut up when he tried to sideline her, continuing to rule until her death. Blanche of Castile, 1188 to 1252, regent of France, crushed rebellious nobles, ran the kingdom while her son Louis IX was off crusading, and was so effective that when nobles rebelled against her, she rode out pregnant to face them down. Margaret of Anjou, 1430 to 1482. When her husband Henry VI of England went insane, she basically ran the country, led armies personally during the Wars of the Roses, and was Shakespeare's inspiration for his scariest female characters. The real Game of Thrones. Here's what medieval history doesn't want you to know. Women were everywhere in the power structures. They were regents when kings were children or absent. They were the powers behind thrones, the negotiators of treaties, the defenders of castles. They ran estates that were bigger than some kingdoms. They controlled religious institutions that were essentially corporations with international reach. The medieval period tried to erase them even as they lived. Chronicles were written by male monks who either ignored women entirely or portrayed them as evil temptresses or helpless victims. Legal documents pretended women didn't exist. Art showed them as either Virgin Marys or whores, nothing in between. But they couldn't erase the evidence. The charters signed with women's seals. The letters they wrote that survived in archives. The buildings they commissioned that still stand. The books they wrote that couldn't be burned. The children they raised who became kings and queens. These women navigated a world that was actively hostile to their existence as thinking beings. They were traded in marriage like property, blamed for not producing male heirs, in an age that didn't understand that sperm determines gender, condemned for ambition that would be praised in men and erased from histories they had shaped. Yet they persisted. They schemed. They fought. They wrote. They ruled. The legacy they left. Every one of these women changed the world. Eleanor's court at Poitiers created the culture of courtly love that transformed European literature. The Arthurian romances, the troubadour tradition, the very idea of romantic love in Western culture, it all traces back to her court. Matilda's fight for the throne established the principle that women could inherit the crown. Every queen regnant after her, from Elizabeth I to Elizabeth II, owes their throne to Matilda's refusal to give up. Hildegard's medical texts were used for centuries. Her music is still performed today. Her theological works influenced mystics and reformers throughout the Middle Ages. She's a doctor of the Church, one of only 4 women to hold that title. Joan's victory at Orléans saved France from English conquest. Without her, there might not be a France. The entire map of Europe would be different. Christine's writings were the beginning of feminist literature. Her arguments for women's education and equality were repeated by every feminist who came after, whether they knew it or not. Mary Wollstonecraft, Simone de Beauvoir, bell hooks. They're all following the path Christine hacked through the wilderness. The truth about medieval women. The medieval period wasn't a dark age for women. It was a battlefield. And these women were warriors, using whatever weapons they had. Armies, words, marriages, money, mysticism. They weren't perfect. Eleanor could be cruel. Matilda was arrogant. Some of them owned serfs and were fine with it. They were products of their time even as they transcended it. But that's what makes them real. They weren't saints, well, except for the ones who literally were. They were women who looked at a world that told them to shut up and submit, and they said no. They said it with swords and pens, with politics and prayer, with marriages and divorces, with children and childlessness. They built cities, real ones and metaphorical ones. They created safe spaces for women in convents and courts. They patronized female artists and writers. They educated their daughters. They passed down power through female lines. They created networks of female power that patriarchy couldn't quite crush. The Renaissance didn't spring from nothing. The Enlightenment didn't appear in a vacuum. These medieval women laid the groundwork. They preserved knowledge. They created institutions. They established precedents. They proved over and over that women were capable of everything. Why this matters now? You might think this is ancient history, but these women's fights are still our fights. The right to education? Christine was arguing for it in 1405. Equal inheritance? Matilda went to war for it in 1135. The right to have your voice heard? Joan died for it in 1431. Reproductive health care? Hildegard was providing it in the 1150s. Every time someone says women are too emotional to lead, remember Eleanor running an empire in her 70s. When they say women aren't strategic thinkers, remember Matilda's escape from Oxford Castle. When they say women can't handle theology or philosophy, remember Hildegard corresponding with popes. When they say teenage girls are just silly children, remember Joan of Arc breaking the siege of Orléans. These women didn't have the vote. They didn't have legal rights. They couldn't own property in their own names, usually. They couldn't speak in public forums. They couldn't attend universities. They had every disadvantage, every barrier, every limitation. And they still changed the world, so the next time someone tries to tell you medieval times were just about knights and kings, remind them about the queens who fought their own battles, the abbesses who ran international networks, the writers who invented feminism, and the teenage girl who saved a nation. The Middle Ages weren't dark because women weren't shining. They were dark because men kept trying to snuff women's lights out. But here's the thing about light. It finds a way through the smallest cracks. And these women didn't just find cracks, they blew holes in the wall.